Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got Ben Wolk with me on this Wednesday afternoon, recording a little bit later this week, but it's been a busy week, and Ben, it's been busy today. We kind of had this delayed a few minutes because of some news from the SEC, but still plenty to talk about and plenty to get into. Let's just start here, Ben. How you feeling? We got a few days, I guess, now until NCAA tournament gets underway. We're in the middle of spring practice. How's things going for you?
No, it's great. It's like I said the last time we were on. Anytime that there are Georgia football practices going on, it's a good time of year. And so we're in week 2 of a 5-week slate for Georgia spring practice. And I think we've got a lot to talk about on that front. I know that you mentioned March Madness coming up, and Georgia had its own successful first night of its postseason basketball tournament as well. So plenty to talk about for us today.
Definitely madness is how I would describe that game. I don't know if you got to watch much
I
of
sure
it,
did.
but we'll get into that a little later. Let's start with what is pretty much breaking news. It was just posted by the SEC about 10 minutes ago, as we're recording on Wednesday afternoon. The schedule and the plan for SEC teams, as far as conference schedule goes, for the 2025 season. We already knew what was coming up for this fall. The plan for the league to stick with an 8 game schedule. The opponents for all the 16 teams had been set several months ago, and they decided today to roll out their plans for 2025. And it's really sticking with what they're doing for 2024. They're sticking with an 8 team conference schedule for all 16 teams. And it's going to be the same opponents that each team is facing in 2024, but you're going to alternate between home and away based on what that schedule is for 2024. So for Georgia fans, that means in 2025, Georgia will host Kentucky, Alabama, Texas, and Ole Miss. They will play away games at Auburn, at Mississippi State, at Tennessee. They will still have that neutral site game in Jacksonville against Florida. And we don't know the dates of any of these games. And I have to imagine it's going to be quite some time before we learn that part of this puzzle and sort of getting a better understanding of what 2025 looks like. But Ben, what's your immediate reaction to this news that it's basically staying with what the SEC has rolled with in past years, and specifically sticking with the 2024 sort of blueprint with the schedule and just flipping between the home and away games?
I don't want to complain because I think that there's some good matchups, and I think that Georgia going to Alabama and Texas this year, and then getting to host them the following year, almost a de facto home and home within your own conference. I mean, there are some positives to it. It feels to me, I don't want to say lazy scheduling because I know it's not lazy. I just know it's a complicated discussion that's going on right now when it comes to the ninth game in conference schedule, maybe TV contract negotiation that's required associated with that. And so it feels to me like this is almost just delaying a year, giving them an extra year to kind of figure out what is the direction of the conference and what is the direction of the best scheduling opportunity for that. So for me, I mean, again, this is going to be the first time in a long time that Georgia has not played South Carolina, and now they're not playing South Carolina multiple years in a row. Teams like Oklahoma that are coming into the conference, you would think Georgia and Oklahoma would find each other on each other's schedule, given the fact they had to cancel their home and home matchup that they already had scheduled. You think they'd find a way to be on each other's schedule within the first 2 years of Oklahoma being in the league? That's not the case. Again, I just think it's a missed opportunity because there's so many palatable matchups now that I think the SEC should do its best to create some of these rivalries. I don't think we're trying to fake any rivalries, but I think by having Georgia and Oklahoma play early and having, all these various matchups that can happen early, they should be happening. And so I'm a little bummed on that front. At the same time, I think the fact that, Georgia's getting to go to Austin for the first time in year 1 of Texas in the league, and then Texas is coming right back the next year. It has the opportunity to create some of those newfound modern SEC rivalries that are going to look a little bit differently than maybe they have in years past.
You talked about the South Carolina rivalry going away. Let's put a little respect on Vanderbilt. That
Of
that
course.
game that game had been played a bunch, and now I guess the only reason Georgia fans have to go to Nashville is either the SEC basketball tournament or if they got a bachelorette party. I mean, that's about the only reason you need to go at this point.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean, again, we're obviously thinking about this through the Georgia lens, but I know that if you ask anybody across every fan base in the SEC right now, there is at least one game that they're not going to have this year that they're thinking, man, it's just weird that that game's not on our schedule. There might be multiple in some cases, and now that's going to be happening 2 years in a row. It just, again, I know it's not an easy solution. And I realize that money is certainly involved when it comes to the ninth game and the TV contracts and making all of that work. But that said, and I know that the fan is generally not the person that people care about in all of this, but I do think that the college football fan should be considered when we're talking about TV contracts and matchups and all of these types of things where it's like, I realize I'm complaining about something ridiculous at this point. The dollar, the bottom line, the dollar is the most important thing in all of this. But I would like to uphold at least some level of the old school integrity of college football as much as we possibly can.
Ben, you hit on a lot of what I would say about the schedule release. On one hand, I get why they did it this way. It's like, hey, we basically have a 2-year capsule. We're just going to stick with that, and then we're going to figure this thing out in 2026. But I just feel like there's no excuse to keep kicking this can down the road. And, once rumbling sort of came out on Wednesday that, an announcement was coming, shout out to John Talty and Alex Scarborough, part of our 24/7 Sports family, guys who have done great reporting, sort of had the ball rolling with this. I sat down and we, at that point, it sounded like it was pretty clear it was going to be an 8-game schedule, but not really clear yet what the teams were going to be. So I sat down and I was like, okay, I would imagine they're still going to play Auburn. They're still going to play Florida. I would think Kentucky because that's been sort of the pairings that have been mentioned when the idea of maybe having 3 permanent opponents. And then I sat down. I was like, all right, who else would make sense? Well, Oklahoma naturally, like you said, they're still new to the conference. Got to play them very early on. What about LSU? What about Arkansas? It's been a while since those teams have played. And then for this to roll out again, on one side, I get it. On the other side, like if Greg Sankey, if anyone in Birmingham were to hear this, figure this thing out by 2026. Get this to a 9-game schedule. Let's make sure that we get the games on everybody's schedule that matter. It just again, I get it. I understand sort of the like, all right, we're going to start at this point and then you know delay a little bit, and we're really going to roll this thing out in 2026. But as just a fan of SEC football, I am disappointed that we're still waiting on a decision. And what I don't understand, Ben, why couldn't they have said, all right, we're sticking with this. And today we are announcing we're going to 9 teams. I mean, it just, I feel like there's a delay and it's all about money, and I get it. But at some point, you got to keep the fans, the fans are the lifeblood of this. And I just think you're doing them a disservice because I don't know very many people who don't want to see this go to a 9-game schedule. And I think the longer you delay, you're going to frustrate people. And I think that's just sort of how it stands.
Well, and it's just weird with I mean, to your point, like the number of teams that Georgia is now not going to play for multiple years in a row. And I complained about this last offseason when they announced the 2024 schedule. The, the number of teams that have come to Sanford Stadium in the last 4 years is, pretty small. Like there were so many programs. Now that's going to change a little bit here because Texas is going to come in 2025. Alabama is going to come in 2025. So there are a few teams that haven't been in Sanford Stadium in a while, but there are so many really good, brand name SEC programs that have not played football games in Sanford Stadium during the best period of time in the history of Georgia's football program. And so it's, you mentioned LSU. I mean, that's one. It's like LSU needs to have a game in Sanford Stadium during this era of Georgia football. Like it's really as simple as that to me.
Yeah, I saw Craig Lawson in the comments getting after Greg Sankey, and someone pointed this out. I think it was Matt Fortuna on Twitter. This all comes out as Greg Sankey earlier this week was pushing for expansion of the NCAA tournament, wanting to get more, major, high major teams in the NCAA tournament. And then on the other side, it's like, well, we don't want to play more conference games because we don't want, these big teams beating up on each other, knocking each other out of the playoff contention. I do find the irony in that. And again, There's been a lot of frustration with Greg Sankey, I think, in the last couple weeks, some of the things he said. And the way I look at it, it's in his best interest to push the SEC forward. On the other side, that doesn't mean everybody's got to let him do that. That doesn't mean the Big Ten and the ACC and the Big 12, everyone else could say, oh, right this way, just do this. I get why he's doing what he's doing, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't roll out the red carpet and say, yes, you just do what's best for the SEC. Because as much as we like watching the SEC athletics and college football in particular, putting them on a pedestal, I mean, I don't think that's good for the sport on the whole.
Completely agree.
Well, we're going to take a quick break real quick and come back and talk about the Georgia Bulldogs, talk about spring practice, and talk about a little bit of recruiting news before we talk about Georgia men's basketball and the NIT. Well, Ben, Georgia is now through 4 of its 15 spring practices as they continue to work toward April's G Day. Looking at what we got to see on Tuesday, very worthwhile afternoon. It was a really busy day between football and men's basketball, but had a chance to talk to Kirby Smart, talk to some of the players, and we got to watch about 15, 20 minutes of spring practice. Now, Ben, that's actually the first time you've had a chance to go out there and watch a little bit of what was going on. I'll start with you. What stood out to you? What kind of caught your attention while you were out there, and the various players and position groups you got to take a close look at?
Well, if you go out to a Georgia football practice and the first thing that you notice isn't Kirby Smart saying something on the microphone, I don't know what you're paying attention to at practice, because, I always think, oh, maybe we'll get out there. Maybe he'll tone it down a little bit because it's a media viewing period. Maybe he's gotten a little bit, quieter, softer in his old age, or maybe a couple championships have slowed. No, not the case. He is as, getting after it on the microphone as ever. It's one of my favorite parts of being at Georgia football practices, or sometimes if you're just in the area nearby, walking around from place to place, you might catch a rogue Kirby Smart comment here or there over the loudspeakers. So that was definitely my immediate takeaway. I also, we sort of divvied each other off as much as we could between offense and defense. And so I was really focused on the offense. It was my first time getting to see Ryan Puglisi up close at a Georgia practice. So I wanted to see how just, we don't see a whole lot. They're just doing a few pass skeleton types of drills, so they're not showing much, but I wanted to see how he just looked physically compared to Carson Beck and Gunnar Stockton. Obviously, Carson Beck is going to look the most calm, poised, collected out there. That's not surprising at all, but I was really impressed by what I saw in my brief time watching Ryan Puglisi, just because it pops. You hear people talk about his arm talent and that the ball flies out of his hand, and it really did. He had a couple overthrows while we were out there, but you could see immediately, all right, there's a reason why Georgia likes this guy, and why you've heard players and coaches alike really talk about the fact that they think there's a lot of promise with him as well. The offensive line is generally sort of separated from where we're watching, so it's sort of sometimes hard to see specifically what's going on there. But I did want to get a look at the offensive linemen, just because there's been a lot of talk about them cutting weight. I know Daniel Calhoun it's been a popular topic about him and the strides that he's made. I know Kirby Smart made reference on Tuesday earlier in the day about Nair Daniels, and I had seen Nair Daniels in San Antonio at the beginning of January for the All-American Bowl, and he definitely, it was obvious he needed to cut weight being out at that event, and he struggled with some speed rushing that he was faced up against. And, Kirby mentioned Nair had cut 40 to 50 pounds, which I think Kirby Smart might have said yesterday that he was at 396 when he got in there. So he had a lot of room to get to that sort of 330 number that they were looking at. And so it's clear that the Georgia Strength and Conditioning program is doing a lot of positive things for that incoming freshman offensive line group, because they all look, a lot better than they did just 3 months ago. Now, I think there's a lot of room for growth and development still there. And I don't think that anybody's expecting any of those guys to be obviously starters, but probably even in the two deep in most cases on the offensive line. But still, I think when you're thinking about growth and what the future looks like along the offensive line, that was one of the first things that I wanted to see while I was out there too.
Yeah, it was good to be out there. That's the second time that we've had a viewing period so far this spring. And I got to be honest, I figured they'd give us one in the first week and then kind of ride it out a little bit. And you're like, all right, you guys will get another one, maybe one more before G Day. So I will shout them out there, letting us get out there and watch a little. Colby Young, I think he's a guy that he's been playing through an ankle injury, but I think you see a lot to like out of him. Big guy. That Miami transfer, I think he's got a chance to be a real factor. You mentioned some of the quarterbacks. I spent Tuesday's practice and that viewing period really watching the defense. I think it's hard not to be impressed with Damon Wilson, the way he's looking. They were working through basically a pursuit drill where they had 3 down linemen. They had them working backwards, and he looked good. I think he was wearing a number 10 jersey. It kind of took us a moment to figure out who exactly that was. But I was impressed with him. Seeing Michael Williams moving around. I know at one point you mentioned Kirby getting after people on the mic. He was all over Oscar Delp for not being able to slow down Michael Williams. He was like, somebody's got to stop Michael. And I think that's music to a Georgia fan's ears, because to me, Michael's one of those guys where you got to get him going this year. I think his sophomore year was a little bit disappointing. His numbers weren't quite as good as, didn't really take that jump statistically that I think people expected. And, the talk about Michael maybe playing an outside linebacker, standing up a little bit more going forward. I think there's a little bit of an excitement around him. So to hear his name, I thought that was a good thing. And yeah, I mean, this defensive line really intrigues me. And I was a little bit bummed out. I was wanting to ask Kirby during his Tuesday press conference just his thoughts on this line, because I think it's a big question. Again, going back to his appearance on Late Kick, he talked about depth on both lines as being something he was really concerned with. And they got some really interesting pieces. They got guys that have been proven like Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson, and they got some other guys that have a chance to prove themselves like Christian Miller and Jordan Hall, among some of those freshmen that have shown a lot. I mean, I really like just looking at Joseph Jonah Ajanye. He is just a huge dude. So there was a lot to take away from that, but defensive line just really fascinates me. And again, if we get a chance to watch them again, be excited to see what that group is doing and who's sort of standing out from the group.
You mentioned Damon Wilson, and I mean, he, like you said, he was wearing the number 10, and I was keeping an eye out for 35. And when we were walking off the practice field, I was like, man, sometimes, and I wrote about this in the practice observations that we did yesterday, sometimes, especially when there's new numbers or transfers or incoming freshmen, and you're sort of trying to associate your brain with certain players and certain numbers, you see someone and you say, man, they look really impressive. It happened to me yesterday with Michael Uni, and number 50, he was rocking the 52 on the offensive line. And I said, man, he looks really good. Of course, the 6'8", 330-pound offensive lineman looks really good. But sometimes guys catch your eyes and you say, all right, when your eyes are gravitating towards someone on a Georgia football team, there's probably something a little bit special to them. And that kept happening to me with number 10 on defense. And I kept, I obviously saw Tyler Williams when they were going through the wide receiver drills. And I was like, no, it's not Tyler Williams. Who is this? Why do I keep going to him? And I couldn't figure out who it was. And then after the fact, we realized that it was Damon Wilson. And he was someone that when I first got eyes on him last year, I thought he was a little thinner than maybe I would have expected him to be, just given the 5-star stature that he had coming out of high school. And so I wondered if it might take him a little bit of time to get physically ready. But seeing him yesterday, I mean, he's someone who has made serious physical growth over the last year. And, I think when Georgia's looking for someone to really step up at outside linebacker, I think, there's been a lot of talk about Michael Williams playing some of that role, but if Georgia can avoid it as much as possible because they have other options there, I think that would be the preferred route. And I think that Damon Wilson is certainly someone, just on look alone, that's someone that I think has a chance to really step up this year.
I got to make sure, because I was sitting there and realized we hadn't mentioned it. We got to talk about Roderick Robinson.
Oh, yeah. I meant to bring that up.
So, for anyone who missed the practice report or the observations, and again, I would really encourage you guys to go read those. I think our readers really appreciate what they get out of those. We got a chance to get there. And basically, as soon as the viewing period started, they were going through basically a perimeter blocking drill where they were throwing at different guys. They had a couple of blockers ahead of them. And I don't know if it was the first person who got the ball, but it was the first one I really noticed. Roderick Robinson, sophomore running back, gets the ball and meets Ellis Robinson. And Roderick Robinson keeps moving, and Ellis Robinson does not. I mean, just absolutely runs him over. A lot to be excited about for Roderick Robinson. And again, I get that that probably didn't feel great if you're Ellis, but that's one of those welcome to Georgia moments, and that might not have been the first for him or any of these freshmen. It kind of comes to the territory once you get to Athens. I got a feeling eventually when we get to talk to Ellis, someone's going to bring that back up. We'll have to see what he says.
Well, I think we brought it up after the fact too. It's easy to see a moment like that. Oh, Roderick Robinson runs over Ellis Robinson and, take a lot away. But again, we're seeing a very small glimpse of these practices. And I'm sure that's happening on a regular basis. And the opposite of that is probably happening on a regular basis as well. But we should also note that's something like a 50-pound gap between Roderick Robinson and Ellis Robinson. And I will also say, I haven't gotten to see Ellis Robinson much in person throughout his recruitment, and he's certainly slim, but his length is immediately noticeable. I said it to you the second we got out on the practice field. I was like, man, Ellis is long, and I think that's going to show up. I think if he just adds a little bit of weight here this spring, he's still got a great chance to get some real run this fall.
So, based on what Kirby Smart was telling us on Tuesday, Georgia's actually getting ready for their first scrimmage on Saturday. Again, they're continuing to work, trying to get in as much work as they can before G Day on April 13th. So, Ben, when you look to the first scrimmage of spring, what do you want to hear about the Bulldogs from that scrimmage? What do you feel like if you hear this, you're like, okay, that was a successful first scrimmage for Georgia as they continue working toward G Day?
Well, for me, and this is one that sometimes there's not like a specific play or statistical reports that come out from this, but I think what's really important for Georgia is that defensively, Raylan Wilson and CJ Allen take on a leadership capacity in some way on the defense. And I think that Kirby Smart was asked about this earlier this week, talking about, I think it was you that asked him about what the linebackers have looked like with Smile Munden out. And I just think that he immediately said young. You can tell how young it is, how much inexperience there is. You can tell that, there's a lot of talent there. And maybe that's why there is such a big gap between Smile and the rest of the group, is because other people in between them realized the talent that was going to be there. But I think you hear so much positive about CJ Allen and about Raylan Wilson, and we've seen it show up. They were thrust into an on-field role as freshmen way more than most freshmen are. Kirby Smart even said in an ideal world, they would just now be coming into playing time. And instead, they have a little bit of that experience. But I think for them, because they do have that experience and because they're not your ordinary freshman or sophomore inside linebackers going through their second spring, I think that it's a real opportunity for them in that scrimmage one to prove, okay, even if Smile is beat up, or maybe if he's not able to be full go at the beginning of the season, that Georgia's linebacker room is, as equipped as anyone to be successful in the SEC. And I think that Raylan Wilson and CJ Allen absolutely 100% have that ability. I just think because they're not new to all of this, them showing in a first scrimmage, all right, they aren't inexperienced, they've done it before, I think will be really important. And it's, interesting to see how that shows up in terms of what we're hearing after the scrimmage too.
Definitely, and I think that is a big one. And those are guys that Georgia's going to count on even when Smile Munden gets back. I mean, I think you're going to see a lot of reps for those guys in the season. To me, with the first scrimmage, I think I kind of put my focus more on offense because I wish I had a dollar for every time Georgia's come out of that first scrimmage. And when we've talked to Kirby after that scrimmage, he's always talking about the tackling was bad, that they've got a ways to go. It's usually like the offense wins that first scrimmage, and then it's a challenge to the defense to clean things up. And, they've got to be able to have cleaner tackling. And then that second scrimmage, you hear about, oh, how good the defense looked after sort of being challenged. So sort of going with that, to me, I want to hear about the receivers. I want to see what combination, who stands out. Again, we mentioned earlier, Colby Young is a guy that's gotten a lot of praise. But what about the other guys? I mean, I've been on the Dylan Bell train for a while now, and I know I'm not alone there, but I think he has got a chance to be like an all SEC receiver. Does he step up? Does Ra Thomas kind of come through? He was a guy that was really hindered by a foot injury last year. Some of the other guys, sounds like Arian Smith has had a really strong start to spring practice. They have a whole lot of options among those receivers. Did those guys rise to the occasion? And I'll also throw Oscar Delp out there because, again, you know, Kirby, anytime that Oscar Delp is brought up to Kirby, he makes it a point to say that he doesn't have to be Brock Bowers, and that's exactly that's the case. But there's no denying what Oscar is following. I mean, he's following the greatest tight end in Georgia history, and you could argue one of the greatest tight ends in the history of the sport. I mean, just imagine what that's like. I want to hear how Oscar does in this scrimmage. Is he able to make plays? He talked about when we had a chance to talk to him on Tuesday that he's been working on catching the ball, being more consistent because that has been an area where he has struggled. He talked about going out and hitting the jugs machine a lot, trying to get in those reps. So very interested to see what Oscar does. And again, all of those passing targets because you got an experienced quarterback coming back. He's worked with some of those guys. He hasn't worked as much with some of those others. What are they able to do in that first scrimmage and who stands out among the group?
I'll add another on the defensive side of the ball that I think it will be intriguing and just more generally is the defensive back rotations and also playmaking. I mean, I think there's a lot of talk about who are the feature cornerbacks. Is Dalen Everett a sure thing at corner, or is it more open to the fact that multiple guys could be factoring into that rotation? And then obviously opposite of Malachi Starks, I think that especially with him, wanting to get as healthy as possible too, they'll probably throw a lot of looks out there with non-Malachi Stark snaps where you're getting Jake Pope and Dan Jackson and David Daniel and Janelle Aguero and whoever else might be a part of KJ Bolden. I'm sure will get opportunities as well. But I think that first scrimmage, they're going to throw a lot of different looks out there to see who works well together, what's working, what's not working. And then as they narrow on within the spring, who is maybe stepping up as the leaders back there, but also the guys that are making the most plays. Because I think ultimately the guys that are making the most plays will be the ones that sort of become the featured starters or whatever that might look like in the fall.
Craig Lawson mentioned Ja'Cory Thomas, which I think is now the second time, Ben, that you have not mentioned him among the safeties again. I mean, he gets it. He knows he's being forgotten. He pointed it out on social media, and Ben has just proven that to be true.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
I think Jake Pope too. I'm not sure if you meant. I mean, they have a lot of options at safety, and again, when we were out there on Tuesday, what I saw, Malachi wasn't really working out there. He was sort of moving around with some of the guys who aren't quite 100%. So this is a big opportunity at safety, just like it is at inside linebacker. I mean, there are a lot of. I think Kirby said, there are a lot of reps out there. It's an opportunity for a lot of these guys. And that first scrimmage is going to be something of a proving ground to show, hey, I'm ready for this, and I could wind up being a starter by the time we get to late August.
I also think these scrimmages are good. A lot of times, we've both done this too. Like, all right, we mentioned guys like Jake Pope and Colby Young and people that are, Jaden Riddell, I know is beat up a little bit, but like the guys that are new to the program that we want to see how they sort of show up. But I really think that especially these first scrimmages for guys that have been through the process before, it's those year 2, year 3 guys that sometimes I don't want to say get forgotten about. I think Dylan Bell is a perfect example of this because nobody's forgetting about Dylan Bell. But when you're talking about who's stepping up in these early spring scrimmages, I mean, there's a great chance that Dylan Bell's, one of the top 5 receivers in the SEC this year. And I think that, sometimes you forget about that because you're worried about the new eye candy or the transfers that come in or the freshmen or whatever that is. And it's like, really, I think these scrimmages are a great opportunity for the people that have been successful at Georgia already to solidify themselves, in the rotation.
Well, let's talk about this past weekend, Ben. There were a lot of visitors on campus as Georgia continues to work to solidify its classes in 2025 and beyond. So, Ben, what did you learn out of this weekend of visits? What should the folks know and take away from what was a very busy weekend in Athens?
Well, I put this on the Junkyard on Dogs 24/7 a few days ago, so I feel okay sharing this now on the podcast. But when I first checked in about how things were going and when guys are going to be leaving campus and how that, was there going to be any news or anything like that was going to come out of it? Really, the immediate feedback I got was there's probably not going to be any public commitments or anything like that come in the next 24, 48 hours coming out of that visit. But what they did want to make clear to me was these are the types of weekends where championships were won. I might be paraphrasing there. I used the direct quote on the Junkyard, but the sentiment coming out of it was this was a resoundingly successful Georgia recruiting weekend. And I'm going to list off just a few names of the guys, and this is not a complete list, but just list off a few of the guys who I've heard some positive feedback on Georgia's end coming out of the visit. That's 5-star offensive lineman David Sanders, 5-star defensive lineman Elijah Griffin, 4-star offensive lineman Josh Petty, 4-star cornerback Dijon Lee, who scheduled his official visit as well, 4-star edge Bryce Davis, 4-star offensive lineman Mason Short, 4-star defensive lineman Christian Garrett from just around the corner, 3-star linebacker Christian Gass, 4-star linebacker Nathaniel Owusu Boateng. Even looking ahead to the 2026 class, there's a lot that I think that could be taken out positively from this weekend. And so again, that was not a comprehensive list of everybody that was on campus, but that is a list of some guys who I've heard some positive feedback coming out of the visit. And I think, we are in the silent commitment time of the year right now where, just to kind of give the timeline idea to people that are listening to this that might not be totally in the weeds on recruiting, this is really the time of year where guys are taking their spring visits, and they might take one, they might take two to Georgia during this sort of month and a half window, but they're going to take a visit or two, and then they're going to have a brief hiatus where in early May, they're going to have their own high school practices, and then May 31st hits, and it's basically back-to-back weekends of official visits. And a lot of guys are wanting to secure their spots in the class right now, knowing that they're going to take official visits come June. This happened last year. I could point to guys like Marquise Easley and Nitro Tuggle and some other guys that made earlier commitments, and in some cases, like Marquise Easley didn't publicly commit until July 7th or July 8th, somewhere around there. But it was around late April, early May. He took a multi-day visit to Athens, came and saw a couple practices, hung out for a few days, and he sort of knew leaving that visit that Georgia was probably going to be the spot for him. And then he had some conversations between that visit and his June 3rd official visit date. And by the time he was on his June 3rd official visit, he'd already let Georgia coaches know that he was going to be coming to Georgia. And so we're sort of in that time of year where you can sort of piece some of those things together. Not every silent commitment turns into a public commitment. We know recruiting gets weird and things happen all the time. But all of that to say, there were some of those types of conversations this past weekend. And I also think that these next few weeks, there's going to be a lot of that with guys that are coming in town, but also people that were on campus this past weekend that are, wanting to have those discussions as they schedule official visits. What I would say is sort of a tea leaf for people as they follow a lot of this stuff. If a guy comes on a visit, especially if he comes on a multi-day visit to Georgia and he schedules an official visit immediately thereafter, he is a serious candidate to end up in Georgia's class. Is that to say that he's going to end up in Georgia's class? Certainly not a guarantee. Now, I will say that May 31st to June 2nd official visit weekend, it's the first one of the summer official visit window. Basically, anybody that's committed to Georgia publicly at that time, I think, is going to be on a official visit for that weekend. And I think that anybody that Georgia feels like they're in really good spot for, or they want to make that last final really important push for, they're probably going to be on that May 31st to June 2nd weekend. Now, that's not to say all of Georgia's 2025 class is going to come from that weekend, because they took a similar approach last cycle as well. And there were still plenty of examples, Jordan Thomas, Joseph Jonah Ajonye, Justin Williams, that took visits later in June, and they still were in Georgia's class, and there really was little drama that came along with any of them either. It's just to say that first weekend of that May-June official visit period is really what Georgia is going to be emphasizing to get, their primary guys on campus.
I would make sure and tell folks if they haven't already, go to dogs247.com. Ben has you covered on recruiting. He's had all kinds of great content this week alone, and there will be more to come. I have no doubt. All right, Ben, the Georgia men's basketball minute. And who boy, it was a tight one last night in Stegman Coliseum. Georgia made its return to the NIT for the first time since 2017. Got about a 23-point lead in that second half against Xavier. The Musketeers came fighting back, but the Bulldogs got the last laugh. They win the game 78-76. Big plays late from RJ Melendez, Silas Demery Jr., and Russell Chiwa to seal that one. Now we're sort of in waiting mode for Georgia. They're going to be watching Wednesday night's game between Wake Forest and Appalachian State. If Wake Forest wins, you'll have the rematch between the Bulldogs and the Demon Deacons. That will be in Winston-Salem sometime this weekend. If Appalachian State wins, the Mountaineers would be coming to Athens. So big win for Georgia. I thought it was a big deal to be able to return to the postseason and get a win. You've secured a winning season by getting that win. I think they're up to 18-16 overall. A lot of good in that game. You know, it was another situation where you see a big lead sort of slip away late. But I thought it was fair what Mike White said after the game, pointing out that, you know, he didn't think this was quite the kind of collapse that we'd seen in some of the earlier games. Xavier kind of came to life. I know that Claude, one of their big guards, made a ton. I think he had 20 points in the second half alone. So stuff to clean up, but Georgia's still playing basketball. And I think if you're a Bulldogs basketball fan, there's plenty to be excited about.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it was right when Georgia went up 23 points. I put a note on the board and I just said best performance of the year because it felt like Georgia couldn't miss. They played the best, and I think Georgia lost the rest of the game by 21 points after that. But luckily, it was only 21 points. It wasn't 24 points, so Georgia still pulled out the dub. I thought you called it out. I thought Silas Demery and RJ Melendez made some really clutch plays down the stretch that, you know, when Georgia was having trouble finding a bucket there late, those two guys were really the two that you could count on. You know, again, I know a lot of people loved it at the end of those games, and you can see it on our board when people, you know, after the fact, people were, what a meltdown. They always point to coaching, all these things. Like, you just won an NIT game, a postseason tournament game, national tournament game for the first time in 8 years. Like, enjoy something. Like, you beat a program that has been much more successful in the basketball world over the last 20 years than you have been. So just enjoy the fact that you pulled out the win. Yeah, was it a little stressful down the stretch? Sure, but that's why you pull out to a 23-point lead, and that's why you hit all your shots in the first half the way that you do, because it gives you a little bit of wiggle room. And so, you know, I don't know. I think it would be fun for Georgia if Appalachian State's able to pull it out to get another home national tournament game. I think that would be the ideal scenario. But, you know, getting an opportunity to go play a number one seeded team in the NIT tournament that you've already beaten this year, I think that's a great opportunity as well. So I'm sure that, you know, Mike White's program, it seemed to me they were very much eager to be playing this basketball game. I know this time of year, and there were a lot of programs that opted out of the NIT. You know, it looked to me like Mike White's team was very excited about the chance to go play a national tournament basketball game. And I think that showed up early, even if it got a little bit, you know, scary there by the end of it.
Craig Lawson says revenge from the 2008 NCAA tournament. Yeah, I mean the Musketeers put the Bulldogs out, so that they had that one coming, and you saw who got the last laugh in this little rivalry. But no, you know, again, you win that game. Georgia covered. They were 1.5-point favorite. They win by 2. You know, good teams win, great teams cover. But
Sure.
Again, Mike White had made the point leading up to that game. You know, he had said, "I don't feel like this team is done playing together." I mean, that there was an excitement and everybody was there, which, you know, that wasn't, you know, there was a chance that guys were like, no, I'm going to go hit the portal. This game doesn't mean that much to me. Those guys showed up, they fought through it. And I thought it was a pretty successful day. And I think about the time, Ben, that you put that comment on the board, my gamer was ready. And guys, let me tell y'all, folks, this would have won awards. This game story that I had, you know, oh, they got this big NIT win, and then, you know, gradually I realized I'm gonna have to rewrite maybe a quarter of this, and then I realized, oh, I'm rewriting this whole story. So you know, the pleasures and the fun of this job, that's just one of the things that comes with covering, especially men's basketball, because you just never know what's going to happen.
Totally. And you mentioned something there as well. I mean, there was the possibility guys could be going to the portal and things like that. And we talk a lot about how ridiculous the college football calendar is at times and the things that they need to do to fix it. I mean, Alabama is getting prepared for an NCAA tournament game and they're taking a transfer in the portal yesterday. It's like the fact that these coaches are preparing for the biggest tournament in sports and they're also still navigating the transfer portal at the exact same time is ludicrous. So that's it's an interesting time in college sports, especially with calendars. You know how much I love talking about the calendar too.
I mean, you're my calendar guy, that's for sure. Ben, before we get out of here, I'm going to put you on the spot, and if you need to think, I'll let you have it. But have you filled out an NCAA tournament bracket? And if you have, who do you have in your Final Four?
In my Final Four, I have filled one out. I have picked UConn to win because I'm real original and I really like to think outside of the box. So, what I will say about UConn is I think their backcourt is playing the best in college basketball right now. I think that Dan Hurley is the best coach in college basketball right now. And I think that there's a lot. I thought that there were a lot of similarities that you could draw to last year's UConn team to Georgia's first national championship team in 2021. And I think in a weird way, you can draw a lot of similarities. There are guys that had key roles on last year's UConn team that I think people sort of forgot about because of all the talent that they had leave. And that was sort of like Georgia in 2021, had all these guys leave for the NFL, 15 draft picks. How are you going to be able to recover from that? And then you look and it's like, well, there's still guys like Brock Bowers that are out there making plays. You know, there's still guys that are featured members of this basketball team. And I think that UConn is like that a lot. And I just think that there's a lot of similarities between Hurley and Kirby Smart, and just in terms of how they're wired and how they coach guys up. So I'm thinking that maybe the theme of back-to-back national champions is going to bleed over into college basketball. I do have to pull up the rest of it. I think I've got UConn over Houston in the championship game. So a 1-1 real creative championship. And then I think I've got Creighton, and I'm blanking on my fourth. So you tell me your four and I'll update you in a second.
So I have Auburn out of that region with UConn. That Sweet 16 game, I think, is going to be a knockdown dragout. So I have them out of that quadrant. I have Baylor. I think Baylor's a team. I think they might be a 3 seed. I feel like they're kind of lurking in that quadrant. I've got Houston. I really like Houston. I've got them. Then I have Creighton. So we do have some shared similarities there. I have Baylor beating Auburn. That's a game that was played at the start of the season. I think that'll be another tough game. Baylor and Houston in the national title. I have the Houston Cougars. I know that Iowa State kind of took it to Houston in that conference title game, but really like Kelvin Sampson. I think he's a really good coach. And yeah, I mean, I would not argue with you on UConn. I think that they're a really good team, and I would not be shocked, but you got to spice it up at least a little bit. So I'm going to have Auburn beating them, and but I'm going to say that Houston winds up winning it.
So in the bottom left quadrant of that bracket, I actually have Arizona coming out of it, which I think is risky because I think that they have a tendency to play down to their opponents. I know they just got upset in the first round last year, but sometimes when you're filling out your bracket, things just work out a certain way where it's like I had chaos in that bracket because I've got Grand Canyon making a run in that bracket. I've got Charleston upsetting Alabama in that bracket. And so when it comes down to it, I mean, Arizona, I had them, winning a 15, winning a 7, and they beat New Mexico, and I have them beating Grand Canyon in the Elite 8. So I think it's one of those, the bracket just worked out in Arizona's favor as I was filling it out. I don't know that I feel that they're a Final Four team, but it just, the road was favorable to them.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. You got to figure out who's going to make the run. And I think the team that would kind of be the Cinderella that I have going farthest is James Madison. I got them beating Wisconsin, then beating Duke, because I'll go ahead and say it, and I might be proven wrong. I think this Duke team is pretty fraudulent. So I've got the Dukes. Hey, shout out your lookalike PFT commenter. He's a big James Madison Dukes guy. I think they're going to make a run. They're sort of my Cinderella of this year's bracket.
I like it. I've got 2 12s getting to the 16th or to the Sweet 16. I've got Grand Canyon and McNeese going to the Sweet 16, which I'm not a big upsets guy in my bracket, as you can see by my 1-1 championship. But every now and again, there's a 12 seed that I really like. And McNeese wins a lot of games, and Grand Canyon, they play a really fun style of basketball. So I like watching them play too.
two former SEC coaches there. So Bryce Drew and no, Scott Drew, right? Scott
Yep.
Drew's the one in Grand Canyon, and then Will Wade. And
Mhm.
in Will Wade we trust, but the S is a dollar sign. So.
Yeah, amen. Hey, that's all fair game now, right? The FBI wouldn't be sniffing around these days, would they?
Will Wade was a pioneer. Not enough people are saying that about the man, and he's doing wonders there at McNeese. Well, we were going to wrap up the episode right there. I appreciate Ben for popping on. Hey, appreciate everyone who is watching this live. We have a ton of people checking us out, and I really, really appreciate that. Be sure, if you haven't already, go to dogs247.com, subscribe there for all the football, continued men's basketball coverage, and all the recruiting news that will come out there. And again, with basketball, be keeping an eye out for transfer portal news. We've been throwing stuff on there as that comes into focus. Also, go to YouTube and subscribe to Dogs 24/7. You'll get all these podcast episodes. You'll get Kirby Smart press conferences, player interviews, as well as Mike White press conferences and men's basketball interviews as well. Also, be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast. Make sure and follow. And please also like, subscribe, tell all your friends about it. We want to make sure everyone is on top of what we got going on in the junkyard. Also, go to TikTok. We're over there now at Dogs 24/7. Need to get back on there and get some more content out there in the next few days. So we'll wrap it up right there. For Ben Wolk, I am Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.